Hello everyone, welcome to my remote events and remote functions tutorial for Roblox. This video was mostly intended to be something new for beginners to learn and a good refresher for people who may have forgotten a lot about remotes. So that's about it. If you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, I always read them, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so before we get started, let's talk about how multiplayer games actually work. So when you click play on a game, what you're doing is you're asking that game service, in this case Roblox, to give you a copy of the game that you want to play. Roblox then sends you a copy of that game for your computer to start running. Now, once your computer starts running the game, every change that you make to the game is only affected on your computer. These are called local changes, and this is the reason why local scripts are called local scripts, because they only change things on your computer. To avoid this problem, there are some local changes that the game engine automatically sends over to the server so that everybody playing the same game as you can see the change that you've made. However, the game engine only does this for changes that it's usually responsible for, such as physics updates or moving your character. So, for example, when you move your character in your game, you don't actually have to use remotes to tell the server about those changes because the game engine is automatically doing that in the background. So what I have here is a visual analogy of changes made in multiplayer games. So, like I said before, everyone has their own local copy of the game running on their computer. So in this case, these two versions of Earth are basically two different copies of the game running on two different computers. This is your computer, this is someone else's computer. So if we look inside of your computer, this is the game that your computer is running. This is your player, this is your game world. Now, most things in your game world should be running using a local script because the local script means that that's code being run on your computer. This is different from server scripts, which run code on Roblox's computers, and then they send all the changes that were made from the server script to all the players. This is also why server scripts may seem slower or laggier to players who are using them to run things like animations or just to move things, because the code is actually running on Roblox's computers and then it has to send that signal all the way from where they are to your computer. Long story short, you should be using local scripts for things like user input, animations, GUIs, and so on. And you should only be using server scripts for things like projectiles, collision detections, data store updates, HTTP service updates, and so on. So anyway, back to the visual aid here. If this player decides to remove or change in some way this part in their copy of the game, let's just say, for example, they remove it, that change is only made on this person's computer. That change is not yet seen on anybody else's computer in their copy of the game. For them, that part is still there and it's still the exact same. It's the developer's job to make sure that if they want everyone to see a change that's made by one player, that one player fires a remote that tells the server to change something so that everybody sees that change. Alright, now that that's out of the way, let's get coding with some remotes. So, now that we know that remotes deal with network communication, we know that we're going to have to at least start with a server script and a local script. So I'm going to go in the server script service and insert a server script, and I'm going to go in the starter player script and add a local script. And just for a little more clarity, since we know that all changes made in our local script are local changes, I'm going to name our local script local change, and anything done by our server script is going to be a global change. I'm going to go ahead and call this global change. Now the first remote I'm going to cover is going to be the remote event. Now the example I'm going to use to explain it is I'm going to have two simulated players, and I'm going to have one player attempt to change the color of the base plate with a local script. So the very next thing we're going to need is our actual remote event object that our scripts can use to communicate with each other. And usually I'll put this in the replicated storage service because it's the most convenient place for all scripts to access. It's also very well organized. So I'm going to right click that, insert object, and remote event. And usually you want your remote events to have a bit of variety in what they're capable of doing while it's still relevant to one kind of thing. So we're not just going to fire this remote event and then it's just immediately going to change the baseplate color. Instead, let's call this remote event something that's responsible for just handling all changes made to the baseplate. Let's just call it baseplate update. Alright, so the next thing I'm going to do is now I'm going to start writing code in our local script. And a few things that I know right off the bat is I know I'm going to be working with the remote event, so I'm going to go ahead and get access to the replicated storage service. So we're going to call this, storage is equal to game get service located storage. And I know I'm going to use the remote, so let's get the remote. Base plate update equal to rip storage, wait for child, base plate update. Cool. Now, it's not enough for us to just fire the event on the local script without us first creating a handler for that event on the server script. So we're going to go to our server script and create what's called an event handler, which basically just executes some code once an event is fired. So I'm actually just going to go back to our local script real quick and copy and paste this code because we're also going to need to access the remote on the server as well. And now we can set up our event handler. So the name of the event we use to set up client-to-server communication is called onServerEvent. So we're going to say baseplate update.onServerEvent, and this is of course an event, so we're going to connect that to a function. And it's also important to know that whenever we're doing this, there's actually a default argument that's being passed to this function once we connect it. And that default argument is going to be the local player that fired the remote event. So I'm just going to call this player, but you could call it whatever you want, just as long as you know that the first parameter is always reserved as the local player who fired the remote event. Any other information that you pass from the local script to the server script is going to only come after this first one. So anything after here is going to be the data that you've sent from the local script, if any. But we'll give an example of that later. For now, all I want to do is just change the color of the base plate, so as soon as this event has been fired and received by the server, I'm just going to change, well, first I'm going to actually access the base plate from the server script. So local base plate is equal to workspace, wait for child base plate. And on the server script, we're going to go ahead and change the base plate's color to something random. We'll say baseplate.brickcolor is equal to brickcolor.random. Alright, let's go back to our local script and fire the remote event so that we can actually see that change for all players. So to fire a remote event from a local script to the server, we're going to use a method called fireServer on the remote event. So we're going to get our remote, which is called baseplateUpdate, and it's a method called fireServer, and we're just going to call that. And again, before I test this, I would also like to give an example of what it looks like when we don't use a remote event. So I'm going to go back to our server script and just copy the line of code that gets our base plate. And I'm going to paste that here. And before we actually fire that remote event, I'm just going to try and change the color of the base plate directly from the local script. Oops, I did not mean to do that. So we'll just try baseplate.brickcolor equals brickcolor.random and just have the local script run that first. Alright, so I just ran the simulation, and as you can see, the results are exactly what we would expect. Since we only changed the color of the base plate with the local script, each player got a random color. So, for example, if I were to go into player 1's local script again, and this of course is the same code, and I disable this and run it again, you can see that we get, again, a different random base plate color, but only for that player. Now if I go back into that script, and I comment out the part where we change the base plate color, but I keep the part where we fire the server, which changes the base plate color. Now, when I run the script again, we should see that the base plate changes to the same color, the same random color on both players. So if we see that, now you can see, whenever I enable this script, we get the same result on both screens. Alright, so that's great and all, but remote events are a lot more powerful than just being able to send and receive a signal. As I mentioned earlier, we can also pass information between the client and server by passing arguments into the method that we're using to fire the event. So the way I'm going to demonstrate this is I'm going to go into my server script here, and we're just going to change a few things around. Now before, I wasn't actually passing any arguments to my fireServer method that we called on the client. I'm just going to get rid of this real quick since we're not dealing with that anymore. But when I fired the server event using this line right here, we just called this method right here. We didn't actually pass any information from the client to the server. But this time, instead of just changing the brick color of the base plate, we're going to pass some information from the client telling us what property of the base plate we want to change, not just restricting it to the brick color. So the two things I want to know for changing the property of anything, really, is I want to know the name of the property. So I'm just going to call this property. And I want to know what value I'm going to be changing that property to. So I'm just going to call that value. And filling in these parameters right here is going to work the same way as any other function would. So the first and second arguments in the parentheses of our fire server method is going to go to the property and value parameters in our event handler. So when I go back to my local script, let's say for example I want to change the transparency of the base plate to 1. So the name of the property is transparency, so that's going to be a string, and the value is going to be set to 1. So when this gets passed on to the server, the string value transparency is going to occupy the variable property, and the value 1 is going to occupy the variable value. So these two arguments right here, in the same order, are being passed to these parameters right here. And if I wanted to pass any additional arguments, for example, anything after these values right here, that would occupy the spaces in the same order right here. So let's just get rid of that. Get rid of that there. And now we're going to want to go to our server script and actually write the code for changing the baseplate's property. Baseplate property is equal to whatever value we passed. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to go ahead and launch the simulation, and I'll cut to when it loads. Alright, and we are back. And so again, as you can see, everything seems to work as expected. On both screens, the baseplate's transparency has been set to 1. We can actually even open the server window and see that on the server, the baseplate's transparency has also been set to 1. So that's good, that's exactly what we want. So I'm going to go back to our player windows here. And just to play around with this a little bit, I'm going to go into player 1's script, and I'm going to go ahead and change the baseplate's transparency back to 0 using this local script. So if I run this, we should see that on both screens, again, it's set back to 1. Maybe I want to change the reflectance of the baseplate, so change the reflectance to 1, why not? If I do that, on both screens, the change is replicated. And I think I've made my point. Alright, so moving on from that, we just talked about how we could have the player send some information to the server by setting up an event handler on the server and then having the client fire that event handler. This time we're really just doing the exact opposite of that. This time we're going to have the event handler set up on the client, and we're going to have the server send some information to a specific client. So I've already modified all the scripts, so we can just get right into it. So I'm going to go to my local script here. And we're going to start by setting up our event handler on our local script. So the event handler on the server was called onServerEvent, which means the event handler on the client should be called onClientEvent. So it's going to be baseplate update, which is our remote event, dot onClientEvent, and we're going to connect that to our handler function. You should also know that unlike our server event handler, our client event handler isn't going to have a default first parameter. Alright, so we're going to stick with the whole baseplate modification example, and we're going to have the server tell our client to change the material of the baseplate in their local copy of the game. So inside of our client-side event, I'm going to say baseplate.material, and I'm going to set that equal to enum.material, and we'll change it to grass. Alright, so now I'm going to go to our server script and try to fire that event. So now that the server is firing a client event, and there may be many clients in your game, we need to be specific about which client we want to communicate with. So first things first, the method that we're going to call on our remote to fire the client-side event is called fireClient. And when you're using fireClient, the first argument is always required, and that first argument is the player that you want to fire the event on. So, for example, if I have two players in a game, player 1 and player 2, they're both going to have that client-side event handler that we set up in the local script, but if I only want to fire the event handler on, say, player 1's computer, then I would actually get player 1 from the player's service and pass player 1 as the first argument to fireClient. So that tells us we are specifically firing the client player 1. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and get the player service from the game, and once I do that, I'm going to create a player added event. So when a new player joins the game, I'm going to have my server script fire the client of that new player. And for those wondering, yes, I am doing voiceover for the rest of this video. My mic was apparently muted while I was recording the last couple of minutes of this video, so that's unfortunate, but hopefully this doesn't throw things off too much. Alright, anyway, so what I'm doing next here is I was just going to take the new player parameter that I defined in that player added event and just pass that directly to the fire client method. So every time a new player joins the game, I was just going to immediately fire their client-side event. But I actually decided against that, so what I did instead was I said if the new player's name is player 1, then fire their client-side event. So any other players that join the game that aren't named player 1 are not going to have their client-side event fired. And these are what the results look like. So as you can see on player 1's screen, the texture of the base plate is grassy because we only fired player 1's event. And on player 2's screen, we still have the same default texture for the base plate. So that's still unchanged. Alright, so what I'm going to cover now real quickly is passing data from the server to the client. And this is really similar to what we did before, so if you have any experience in functions and using, passing arguments to functions, this should make complete sense to you. Basically, since the first argument of our fire client method has to be the player that we want to fire the event on, only the arguments after that first player argument are actually going to be sent to our client event handler. So when I create this print message parameter on the client event, it's really just going to be the hello world string that I sent from the fire client method. In other words, the second value we're passing to our fire client method is just being passed to the first parameter of our client event.